recent study came out from some big credit union saying that the average millennial thinks that the gift they're going to receive is around $350,000. Okay. They surveyed people in the credit union and said, how much do you plan to leave? And it's a couple $100,000, maybe a little less. Can you imagine you leave something behind, your kid thinks it was going to be more, and they're mad at you after you pass away? You were leaving a gift. Like that sounds terrible.
This may look like it came from your mom and dad, but if our theology is sound and if we see all of that correctly, it's coming from God.
That's right.
It's not coming from your parents. That's just whose hand it came through.
Yeah.
But God is the one who's ordaining all of that. And so for us, it's incumbent on us to teach you well.
All right, here we are. Welcome to the Next Sunday podcast. I'm here with my friend, Jim Shepard, who I recently got to create an epic memory with, one that I will not forget.
Hey-o!
It was so much fun. So, Jim, we were celebrating. We were pre-celebrating your birthday.
Pre-celebrating.
Okay,
Right,
we were
birthday
in
month,
Santa
I
Fe,
guess,
New
or
Mexico.
something. Whatever, yeah.
And we were there with a bunch of people that were already gathered together. So we're like, let's surprise Jim. Your wife was the primary conspirator.
Shocker.
To make this happen. And part of the celebration was something that she knew would bring you great joy, which was a silent disco.
I love silent disco.
Which many of the people there had never experienced before,
Right on,
so this was
right
a big deal. You had a 2-dance minimum, and we saw some people cut a rug and really let loose and have some fun. But then while it was going on, there's something that we all checked off our bucket list because this was epic. Jim, why don't you tell them what happened?
You just didn't know you had it on your bucket list,
idea.
Frank, but you know you do now, and you went over and you checked it off. You have always wanted to attend a birthday party so epic that it shut the power down. And you did.
We did.
We didn't shut it down in the hotel, not just the block. We shut down a quarter of the city.
The city was shut down. No power, no AC,
None.
No
But we're
lights,
oblivious to it all.
No clue.
Because they're running the laptops on battery. The headphones are on Bluetooth.
Yeah.
Even the lights they had in the room, they turned out all of the main lights. They've got their can lights that are running on batteries. We're oblivious. And somebody said, hey, did you know the power is out? I was like, what song is that?
Right. We're totally confused.
Did you get that? Did you know the power is? I don't know that song.
Oh, dear.
Hey-oh.
Yeah. So, but it was so much fun, right? So,
We had a blast.
we were having a blast. And then at some point, party starts to wind down.
Yeah.
And people go to their room and then come back and they're like, hey, so it was a hey-oh. It was a hey, do you know that, like, there's nothing. People walking around with candles and little teeny flashlights. And we're like, wow, this was one epic party.
Epic party.
We'll just call it a rager. We had the Jim Shepard Rager was happening in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was a fun memory.
It was a great
sure.
memory for all of us. Y'all were so kind to me that night, but I'll never forget that we shut the power down, Frank.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And hey, if you are listening to this podcast while you're mowing the grass or driving, if you'll click over to our YouTube channel while we're telling that story right at the beginning, I've got some photos that we will edit in of you dancing, wearing some Care Bear knockaround sunglasses that were a gift. That was pretty fire, I would say, of you, Jim.
Someone took a guess. You know, I love those knockarounds, right?
Sure,
because if you lose them, who cares?
No big deal.
But they're great.
Yeah.
Polarized and all that. But I did not have a Care Bears pair.
By the way, Knockaround, if you want to sponsor the next episode, we've done a good job of promoting you.
Sponsor the next episode.
That's great. Thank you for your sponsorship in advance.
In advance.
Yeah, we'll appreciate that. Well,
awesome.
Hey, let's get into our topic
Let's
today.
go. I'm excited about this topic
one.
today, Frank. I think it's, I have a passion for a lot of things, and I've enjoyed all of our episodes, but this one I really love because it's a conversation that I feel like a lot of people are talking about. The Wall Street Journal talks about it. There's a lot of talk in culture about it. I don't feel like the church is really speaking up and finding its voice on it. And that's really what we hope to do today, is to help the church find its voice on this topic.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, we are going to see over the next 20 or 30 years a wealth transfer primarily from boomers to millennials and maybe a little younger, okay, of about $100 trillion. There's a debate on, is it 70 trillion or 100 trillion? I don't think it matters. That's a number bigger than any of us could ever
Mind
understand.
officially blown.
Absolutely.
Mind is blown.
Insane amount of wealth that's being handed from one generation to another. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe, or I certainly haven't heard the church talking about how do you help support the people that are leaving that inheritance. How are they doing it in a godly way? What guardrails do they need? How are they setting their family up for success? And then these young people that are going to be receiving, some will get an instant cash injection of 4x their salary. Some will get 40x their salary. I mean, it could be something insane. How do we help them know how to navigate that? And what does the Bible have to say about all this? Right. It's going to be a great conversation today.
Yeah. And I think you're articulating this well, Frank, because there's two groups of people we want to speak to today. Well, actually three. We want to speak to the church, but we want to speak to the church about its perspective on two groups, the people doing the handoff and the people receiving the handoff, right? There's implications for all of that. So I'm excited about this conversation.
Yeah. So let's start by saying when it comes to those giving the handoff, okay, where do they even begin to approach this from a biblical standpoint? Does the Bible even give any clarity, any guidance to going, okay, over time, God has entrusted me with more and more. Much of that I've invested in a 401k or saved or whatever. I built a business or a company. And when I pass, I'm going to leave a significant amount of wealth, whatever significant be relative to all different kinds of people, to my kids or somebody or something, some organization. Where did they begin to even look for answers? Because as best I know in America, the answer is currently, without the church's support, the answer is an equal distribution among your children, period, in a will or estate.
Yeah. You have $12 million estate. Mm-hmm. You have 3 children. They get $4 million apiece.
Yep.
But
that could be a terrible idea.
That could be a terrible idea for reasons that we're going to articulate inside of here, right? So it's this, Frank, and I want to be careful. I'm not throwing shade at people individually, but I want to talk about a group of people. The people that I know generally they're not going to get kingdom-minded advice from is their wealth advisor. Mm-hmm. Because they're managing to a different set of objectives. Those might even be noble and virtuous, but not aligned with kingdom objectives. And I'm talking about people who are spiritually mature, God-fearing men and women who are doing this.
Yeah.
I think some of it is they just don't know that there's another group of people, and there is another group of people, a group called Kingdom Advisors, inside of, Ron Blue and some of his friends started that, and it's people who are managing assets, but helping Christian people manage it toward godly principles and godly objectives, right? That's what we're talking about here. And so we have to speak to that for the people doing the handoff. And as you and I have established just in the first 6 episodes, there's a lot of work for the church to do because our approach has become more transactional than transformational. Mm-hmm. And it's not even grounded in lots of day-to-day wisdom, right? So what happens is, I think we all know, most of us on this podcast, hopefully, if not all, know the parable of the talents, right? Matthew 25, 16 through 30. Talents is not, my abilities. It was a sum of money. It was like, cash. So we know that, and what the implications for that are that we were given something to manage in the best interest of the owner, and the owner comes back and says, hey, how'd you do? Mm-hmm. How'd you do? And that has implications for the person doing the handoff. Here's my big concern, Frank. We spend a lot of time talking, even at Generis, talking to you about your annual giving, your regular ongoing tithes and offerings, maybe even a capital campaign, whether it be one fund or traditional, where you accelerate your giving and accelerate it. But the single biggest gift you'll make in your life is the one that you make when you die. Because you're handing off everything you've accumulated to someone or some organization in some cases, right? And we've got to teach well because there are some cultural norms that are not lined up with biblical norms. And we want our people to be able to make their decision on the basis of what would the one who gave it to you in the first place expect you to do with it?
That's so good.
Right?
That's so good.
And King David says, I love that text in 1 Chronicles 29, about verse 15, when he says, everything we give has come from your hand, Father. Nothing that we've given has come from any other hand. It's from you and you alone. And who am I and who are we that we even get to do this in the first place, right? And so we just haven't taught them well. So they're going to follow the path of least resistance, which is probably a wealth advisor, maybe even a godly wealth advisor, but who doesn't understand the whole idea of managing toward godly objectives, not toward, say, family objectives or whatever else might be out there.
They're thinking tax mitigation, growth of that. Hey, you're developing it, invest it properly, manage it. All good things. Like, those aren't bad things in and of themselves at all. Like, I think we should lean in on those. But when it comes to our family, which is a big part of this conversation, when it comes to the church, God has entrusted us with this 401k, this life insurance policy, this business, whatever it may be. And we have given a large portion of our lives to growing something.
Yeah.
And yet we spend little time wrestling with how that transition will take place. And yet there's a high probability, I think, okay, this is a frank statement, okay, it's not on behalf of generis or even maybe from Bible, I don't know, but I'll say this. There's a high probability that your handoff of wealth to the next generation will hurt them more than help them.
Ooh, Frank. So I think what if I had to guess, I would guess you're talking about, maybe you're not talking about, but the reference would be people who win the lottery.
Yeah.
People who buy these tickets all their lives and they want to win the lottery, and then they do, and then we hear the story of what happened to them afterwards. And far too many, 7, 8, 9 out of every 10, end up in horrific stories of sadness, family breakups, relational problems, just all of these things. And I think of it like, my analogy would be something like, let's just suppose you're a decent swimmer. You can swim 4 or 5 laps in the pool in your backyard. But if you went to Niagara Falls and all of that cascade of water coming down and all of that momentum coming against you, you might not be able to survive that. Now think about that. That's the cascade of money that just comes all of a sudden toward you. And you're accustomed to swimming. You can manage your salary and your wife's salary and the savings that you've got. But this massive cascade of new income and money comes into your life and you're not prepared for it because we didn't teach you well in the church, right? And so, let's go back to the handoff even. Think about it this way, Frank. We've taught you to be a good steward every year in the church. What the regular ongoing giving, capital campaigns. But in the very last breath, you make the worst stewardship decision of your life in the handoff of everything you've accumulated.
Wow.
So the worst decision you make, if we haven't taught you properly, right? Let's speak controversially here for a second. And I know this is not going to be a popular topic. It's probably going to grab some mind. We don't mind challenging the status quo. That's what we've said here. We want to challenge the status quo with the intent of making you better, not causing you to get mad at us. You might. That's okay. Send those cards and emails. Send it. frankbeeler@generis.com. All of them go to him. He handles all of my correspondence for me. See what I did there? But it's this idea, and James Wise talks about this in his book Inheritology, which you've read and I've read. And both of us love it.
So good.
The idea of preference among heirs. And when we say heirs, we're talking children specifically. So what about the idea of, my wife and I are very godly. We're committed to God. We're thankful to God for all. We've gone to generous giving events. We've done all these other things. We're really into the flow. But we have 3 children, none of whom are godly or in the church or maybe even saved. And none of whom are wise in the management of money. We've watched their lives. You can watch them and you can see they're just not wise in the way they...
Yeah.
And so I have this significant accumulation. I liquidated a business. I've funded my IRAs. I've got all this other stuff. I've got a pretty significant accumulation. Is it biblically wise for me to hand that off in my last moment to those 3 children? Let's complicate it a little bit more. What if one of them's godly and wise and the other 2 aren't?
Yeah.
We're causing some family stress right here. That's family stress. But it's so that you could align with the biblical objective, so that you can stand before God and say, hey, I handed it off to somebody who's probably going to do even better than I did in the way that they're going to honor you with it, right? That's the parable of the talents. That's all about hearing, well done, good and faithful. Not just in what you did with it in life, but in that last moment, that last breath. Did you hand it off to someone who will honor God with it the way that you did? Whew.
It's a big idea. It's everybody's going to deal with it at some level. They're either leaving behind debt or they're leaving behind some kind of wealth, right? I mean, that's the reality.
Right.
In this specific conversation, we're talking about those that have accumulated something and they're trying to figure out how to navigate that handoff. So practically speaking, how does the church raise their hand and say, we want to help you with this? You know, how do you, hey, those of you that are about to die, I'd love to gather all of you together. Just speak to that church leader a little bit of going, where do you communicate what you just said? How do you get that out there to the people that are wrestling with this and cause them to reflect and think about this differently and change their posture and possibly their mindset?
So I think there's a couple of things that come to mind right off the bat for that, Frank. First one is that as the church is seeking to teach, it ought to be about transformation, not about a transaction and getting money from them. Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's a big mistake. We've said this many times in other forms of giving. You know, the whole idea of transactional is you're making the church the main recipient, not the giver, the main recipient. You know, Philippians 4:17. Same thing applies here. We can't just be looking out at our congregation and thinking, oh my gosh, if we just had a small percentage of what they've accumulated, can you imagine what we would do with that? No. Can't do that. We can't do that. It's what I call the bow and arrow approach. You know, we've got the bow and arrow out and we're just shooting at targets hoping to get something for us. That's not what we're talking about here. We want to serve our people well so that they can give a good answer on that day. So that their answer in Matthew 25:16 through 30, when the Lord speaks to them about it, is, hey, I did the best I could to honor you with it in my own life, and I handed it off to people who may even honor you better than I did, but at least as good. Yeah. And the Lord would smile and say, that's what I want you to do with that. That's exactly what I wanted you to do.
It's interesting. I don't even know that it's more complicated than asking the question of people in the congregation, hey, when you're thinking about giving, for some of you you're not giving, we believe that you should start giving to the local church, being a good steward, being faithful with the principles that we see in Scripture, okay? Continuously grow in that. For those of you that are in a different season and you're trying to figure out what that handoff looks like to the next generation, how has God factored in the equation? How are you letting God guide you in making that decision? I believe that statement alone, that question alone, asked on some small measure of frequency, is compelling enough to cause people to reflect and pause and step back to go, I don't know that I factored God in the conversation. And when I say factor God in the conversation, I'm not talking about a gift to the church. Right. Like that's not even what I'm talking about. I'm literally saying, okay, God, it looks like when I pass away, I'm going to have this amount left over. And I've got to do something with that. I want to take care of my kids. I've got 6 kids. I can't fathom not trying to do something to give them a better life and set them up for the future. I can't fathom that. Yeah. I don't believe that God's telling me not to do that. But to your point, I've got 6 kids. They're all very different. And they would handle an injection of resources very differently. And some right now, I think it would hurt them. If they were to get it all at once, it would not be good. And so I need God's help and guidance and wisdom on trying to figure out how to navigate that. But then in the midst of this going, okay, why did God allow you to accrue such wealth? Okay, why did he allow you to do that? You were faithful. You worked hard. He blessed your hand at whatever you were doing. Now what? And so where does the church factor in? Where does the handoff of people? Where do you hand to somebody and say, hey, I tried to grow this. Go grow it more for the glory of God. And who is that in your family or near you? And what does that look like? It's a big conversation that I think just starting to ask can be a great place to start, because then they're realizing, wait a second, last time I met with my CPA or my wealth advisor, we just talked tax mitigation the whole time. We never discussed how to distribute this money in a godly way.
Well, Frank, that's such a big idea that I need to ask your forgiveness for the blog post that I'm going to write about it. And I'm going to try to remember that you were the source of everything I got there. So would you just go ahead and forgive me if I forget to put your name in there somewhere?
Absolutely.
That's a massive thought. That's a great thought. And what I love is you talking about your 6 kids, right? And I know 5 of them. I haven't met James, but I know 5 of them. And you're right. They're all different.
Yep.
We're not sure how Ezekiel would handle all of this.
He's a little small.
We've got some clues. We might even have a clue how Malachi is going to do it. He's only 2, but we got a clue.
That's right.
Right? And also, let me just back up and say, I'm not saying cut your kids out altogether. No. I did not say that. Don't hear me say that. I'm just saying you wouldn't want to leave the bulk of what you've accumulated to someone who would do something different than you would in honoring God with it.
Yeah.
That's the idea that the church has to get across for those that are making the handoff.
And because that's such a hard conversation, okay, I want to honor God with it. That may look different for your different kids on how that plays out. You need the church's help and wise, godly leaders helping you navigate that. Because right now, coming to mind, I have one kid, maybe a couple kids, that would be like, go grow this for the glory of God. And I think that's the end of the conversation. They'd figure out their own path, but they could do that in a proper way. My wife and I have had an honest conversation that there's one child that we have right now that, well, not right now, forever, one child that in this season, first thing he would do is go buy the fastest car he could buy. And I don't know that he would, literally, we said he could kill himself on the interstate. Like, how would we feel to leave money behind equally distributed with no filter, even though it's hard? It's easier just to do that. Split it even, not deal with the pain of it. Okay. But to have that honest conversation to go, I don't know that this would be wise or good stewardship of us to leave it this way. Our son may leave this earth sooner than God intended if we don't handle that well. I mean, that's the weight of this, of going. Totally. And so if that's a true statement, this is where I go back to the church. The church has got to be willing to say, hey, we want to help you navigate this. This is super messy. There's a godly way to do this. We've got to figure that out. It's all individualized. We got to process this together. But we need to say, hey, we're here for you. We're going to help you navigate this. We're going to pray with you. We want to support you. We want to give a safe space for you to wrestle with this idea, because the idea of me right now thinking that Jess and I are on a plane together and we pass away and we leave what little that we've accrued so far to our kids, if we were just to do even in a will, I don't think that would be godly. That would be a good steward of what God's entrusted to our care and what's best for our kids. And yet anything other than even distribution, like, breaks my heart, confuses me, makes me struggle to figure out how do I even navigate that.
Yeah. So I think what we're saying is it has the potential to be awkward and messy.
Yep.
But it is super important. If you are intending to stand before God and give an answer for what you did with what he left, what he put under your stewardship in this life, it becomes a very, very important question. And I would say, Frank, it requires us to take the awkwardness and the messiness head on as it comes to us. Right? That's the hard part. And that's what we're talking about, pushing against the status quo and getting people like, hey, look, get somebody who is a Kingdom Advisors wealth manager to speak to your people. Put them in front of people that you know will infuse them with godly principles and steer their management of their estate toward godly objectives, right? And that gives you a much better chance of working this out, even through the messiness. It won't be the first time that they've helped people to navigate the problem with heirs. They do that all the time.
Sure.
It's their job. Maybe messy and awkward for you, but get somebody in who knows how to help you, row upstream against the tide in that and get to an answer that, that is pleasing to God. That's the whole idea, is that we want you to get to an answer that's pleasing to God, right? Yeah. Now, let's talk about the other side, Frank. Those who are receiving this. I mean, there's an equal level of concern for stewardship on their end, right? And that's where I think the church has to be, it's not just teaching biblical principles. You have to teach practical principles as well that line up with biblical principles. What am I saying when I say that? The world would teach us that the way you deal with money is you live, save, give. The Bible would teach us the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
That you give first, you save second. So the common denominators, both of them have saving in the middle. And then you spend the rest on lifestyle. The problem is if you're spending, if you're in credit card heaven, right? You're spending more than you take in. You're spending 108% on yourself. So there's nothing to save and surely not anything to give. And we have to turn that upside down, right? And teach younger generations it's give first, save second, and then lifestyle third, right? And so, what we've tried to do in my house is the idea of not just 20%, but 25%. Your give and your save should be 25%. Try to live on 75%. That's not law per se, it's wisdom. But it's wisdom that lines up with the Bible, right? So it would be important that we've taught those receiving it that as you get it, it's not a license for you just to go wild on a spending spree. There might be some things that you could appropriately, spend money on.
Sure.
There could be those things. But use wisdom backed by biblical, principles to make those decisions.
Absolutely.
Right? And so don't let, depending on the size, some will get smaller inheritances. It won't challenge them as much. Some will be living modestly, and they get much larger inheritances. And that's that Niagara Falls that I talk about, that cascade of water that's coming against you. You know how to swim, you just don't know how to swim in this water.
Yeah.
Right? You know how to manage money. You know how to manage your salary, your wife's salary, and your savings and your 401k. You know how to do that. But you that's swimming the laps in the backyard. This is a whole different body of water coming against you, and you don't know how to swim against that. You're going to need some help.
The church has this amazing opportunity to help people, this younger generation, also not be surprised. Okay, so a recent study came out from some big credit union saying that the average millennial thinks that the gift they're going to receive is around $350,000. Okay, they surveyed people in the credit union and said, how much do you plan to leave? And it's a couple $100,000, maybe a little less. There's a delta. Surprise, like no pre-conversation, like they literally haven't talked about this. And so if we're going to steward it differently, and or as parents, if we have an expectation when we leave something behind to our kids, or grandparents leaving something to grandkids, whatever it may be, who's having the conversation of what we expect to happen with that? And so if the church can step in and say, hey, we're helping those that are leaving money behind navigate it and be godly stewards of what God would entrust to their care. We're equipping practically budgeting, saving, all the things, the generation that's now receiving it, operating differently, understanding generosity, understanding what it does to their heart and changes their life forever, way more than a little bit more money that they get to keep. Right? And so we're having those conversations. What if the church is also willing? Once again, we don't mind walking in the mess in the church, or we shouldn't avoid it, to say, how are you having this conversation before a will reading? How are we doing this so it's not disgruntled? Can you imagine you leave something behind, your kid thinks it was going to be more, and they're mad at you after you pass away? Well, that's not, you were leaving a gift. Like that sounds terrible. But once again, we've got to be willing as a church to make room to help people navigate the messy, and to help those younger people know, once again, how to manage it, what to do, how to get their arms around this thing, how to slow down and just be mindful of what God's entrusted to their care, and let them truly receive it as ultimately a blessing from God, not a blessing from their parents.
Yeah, that last piece, Frank, that's the big idea here. This may look like it came from your mom and dad, but if our theology is sound, and if we see all of that correctly, it's coming from God.
That's right.
It's not coming from your parents. That's just whose hand it came through.
Yeah.
But God is the one who's ordaining all of that. And so for us, it's incumbent on us to teach you well, so that when that does happen, You know, what would be the outcome? What would be an ideal outcome? And I know this is a highly idealized outcome, but what if it looked like this, Frank? What if it looked like, you know, my mom and dad have built this business and they have a sizable asset to transfer, and it comes to me, and I just move it off to the side, and I've got management and all that. But in my financial life, I act as if it never happened.
Yeah.
I don't adjust to anything. My lifestyle doesn't change. My spending doesn't change. Nothing changes. And I begin stewarding this over here and looking for places. Okay, what would my mom and dad want me to do with this money? What would honor God with this money over here, right? And maybe part of it would be that you allocate some money for your kids' education.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I've said many times, it's just personal for me. I think one of the greatest investments that Nancy and I have made was in our kids' education. Mm-hmm. If you're not going to invest in them, what are you going to invest in?
Yeah.
Right? And you only have a short window to do that, so do that and do that well. I know some can't, and I'm certainly not speaking against those who are not able to do that economically, but if you have the opportunity to do that, it's a phenomenal opportunity, right? But to receive that in such a way that it doesn't cause you issues. I mean, we talked about winning the lottery. Frank, you probably know. I mean, there's a couple of famous families around Atlanta that it's not just I know of them. Their life has been very public. Mm-hmm. And they have great-grandparents who did something amazing. And the second and third generation is a mess. We're talking about addiction. We're talking about divorce. We're talking about family dysfunction at a very high level. You know, I'm not going to call their names, but in Atlanta, you wouldn't have to go very far to figure out, you know, who I might be talking about. I mean, there's some famous families here. And I'm not criticizing them. I'm not showing shade. I'm just saying we can learn from people who have done this before. It just causes havoc if people are not ready for it. And we as the church can help them like nobody else. We can help you be ready for that.
Yeah. If the church is unwilling to help and have these conversations, because it's a little awkward to drive these conversations, right? It can get even more awkward when you actually ask for it and start helping these people through it. It gets messier, right? If we're unwilling to do it, it feels like church leadership and the families that are leaving things behind are simply crossing their fingers and hoping it's all going to work out. Oh, like there's no plan. So they're going, well, it'll all be better when. Not a biblical principle at all. That just magically things going to get better. It's a behavior over time. It's learning. It's growing in our faith and our journey. But for some reason, we're reading about these trillions of dollars that are transferred. We can't even comprehend the amount of wealth that's being transferred. And yet, I will say a vast majority of the people that are handing over that wealth are truly just crossing their fingers and hoping their kids are okay.
That's such a big idea, Frank.
Yeah.
You know, and it's trite to say it, but it was never truer than what you just said. Hope is not a strategy.
Yeah.
And especially not a strategy if you're trying to live your life in such a way that you can wind up your Matthew 25:16 through 30, and you can stand before God and say, I gave it my best. I gave it my very, very best to honor you, to worship you, to show awe and reverence to your name, with everything you put under my hand to manage during the time I had on earth. That's the whole point of that text. Yeah. It's not more complicated than that. I mean, you can make it more complicated than that, but that's all it is. It's just whatever you have. Because remember, the three stewards had very, very different amounts that they were given. The expectation was the same.
Yeah.
Right? That you're managing this toward an outcome that honors the master. In this case, obviously the master is God himself, Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? And that's who you're honoring. And so they're different, but the expectation is the same, toward a godly objective, right? And we have this opportunity to help our people do better. I would say this too, Frank. We'd be remiss if we didn't say this before we go away. You know, if you start having these conversations, be prepared for the cynic to come in and say, oh, Pastor, I know what you're doing. You figured out how much money I've got, and you're just trying to get some of it. But Frank, aren't there cynics to almost anything that we do in the church?
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're recruiting soloists for our worship, oh yeah, there they are. They're just going to pick the ones that are the most gifted. Yes, that is correct. We are going to pick the most gifted singers. We will unapologetically. We are not going to put somebody up there who sings like Frank or Jim.
Facts.
We might put them in a choir. But they're not going to have a microphone by themselves, right? And so it's this whole idea of us helping them to do that well. to do that well, and the church has that responsibility.
Yeah.
And so cynics will have their place, but that shouldn't get in the way of us doing what we do, right? They can think they know what our heart's intention is, but our heart's intention has to be to serve you. Frank, I want at the very last breath, the biggest stewardship decision you make, I want it to be your best one.
That's so good. That's so good. I love that. Oh man, that resonates so well. I want that too. And I would assume that people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s that are wrestling with this now, that's what they want. They don't want it to be a bad decision. They don't want to avoid it. They want to be good and faithful with what God's entrusted to their care. I truly believe that.
They do.
And so, gosh, and they're thinking about that. They're thinking about how this is going to affect their kids. And at the end of the day, that cynic that's pushing back on everything, that's always going to have some comment, oh, here they are talking about money. You know, my mind immediately goes, even before the money, my mind goes to the heartbreak and pain that comes with money mishandled. And so as a church, we're going, this could get messy. This could be breaking you. This could break your family. How many times is the current boomer the glue? And when that boomer's gone, the siblings scatter. There's tension. A lot of times around money. You know, gosh, no, the church steps in on that. It's another place where they step in on the mess. Jim, I love what you've shared. I think you've given some great wisdom today. We're going to wrap up this episode. We'll keep talking about all this stuff.
I apologize that I didn't have any passion or any thoughts on this. I'll try to do better for episode 8, Frank. Maybe I can bring something to the table next time. I'm just because it's in my generation, and I see that people in my generation, and I hang around with the young leaders, so I see both sides of it, and I see where the church has this opportunity. Let's not let ignorance and unawareness get in the way of people doing what they should do as God-fearing people, and let's help them be better at that.
That's so good. Hey, listen, if you enjoyed this episode, if you found like a part of this episode was helpful, we encourage you to share it with a friend and tell them, hey, they talked for a little while, but if you skipped ahead to this moment, I found this to be really helpful. I know you're wrestling with this. Maybe church leaders, this could be a tool for you to use to help spark some of that conversation or support conversations with someone that's maybe approached you or is dealing with this right now. They're trying to figure out what to do next. And so hopefully this is a helpful tool for you. We'll be back with another episode of next Sunday very, very soon.
Hey-o.
Hey-o.
Hey-o.